while we're waiting for that, let me just say another good afternoon to everybody, and also a big thank you to the organizers, to the Monsignor and his colleagues here at the Pontifical Academy. It's an honor to be here. And also, it's been fascinating so far today to hear the many different presentations. I did prepare a paper. It's on the table if you're interested, but given what has been discussed today, I've also diverged slightly from the paper. Because there's been so much conversation around technology, I've added a piece on technology to what I'll be presenting today, because it's a direct area of interest of mine, even though it wasn't so much dealt with in the paper itself. So I'm going to talk today building on the encyclical and Pope Francis's focus on the poor and marginalized. So I'm hoping that almost everything I say today will give you a sense of that particular perspective, and I'm going to focus on it in several different ways, and then if there are issues you'd like to come back to in greater depth, we will go there. So this is the overview. We know that globalization and climate change are happening, and we also, others have made the claim here and elsewhere that the poor and marginalized populations will be most affected. That comes up in the encyclical as well. It's also said, we've had people say it already today, that the best preparation for such populations in order to adapt are literacy and education and some combination of those and related areas that we've talked about. We also know that educational systems are insufficient. Various people have spoken about that, and we know that a couple of months ago we had the new SDGs that include education and literacy. So where I'll end up is some new ways, I think, that we need to think about learning and literacy among the poor. That's the basic agenda of my talk. So first, in case some of you may not be ecologists in the group. I wasn't until I went to an early, sorry, we lost the slide. Can we get that back, please? That was the World Ecological Footprint, if you didn't see that. I don't know if somebody is paying attention in the back room, maybe not, which essentially shows that over the last half century, we have been exceeding the ecology of our planet up to about 150% of what the planet can bear. That's what the slide shows. You'll just have to maybe trust me. Of course, whenever you say, this is another side stalling tactic, but whenever it is that you say you're going to talk about technology, the technology fails. So anyway, believe me about that we're not living within our means. Okay, let's skip. Okay, so there's that graph, that famous graph. If you don't know it, you should check it out. It basically says we're in deep trouble. The next slide may not be quite as obvious to many of you, and that is that both the previous slide and other factors are leading to greatly increased urbanization around the world. It's everywhere in the world, but especially in developing countries. You can see it by region. It's a fairly well-known slide, and urbanization does appear in the SDGs also for this reason. Somebody, maybe more than one person, mentioned migration. Of course, you only have to open up the newspapers in Europe to know that migration is on people's minds, but this graph actually shows that it's been going on for a long, long time, long before the current crisis. There have been dramatic increases of migration in lots of different directions, but particularly from the south to the north, but also south-south. Now, these are factors that you often hear in talks about, let's say, sustainable development. And what I'm going to try to do is tie them in directly to education. So the next slide shows who gets impacted, where these vulnerabilities, which are in the previous three slides, globalization, migration, urbanization, it's the women, people with disabilities, migrants, minorities, children, elderly, youth, who are going to be subject to these, more subject to natural disasters, climate change, industrial hazards, and so on. There isn't a lot of disagreement about this. But when we get to the SDGs, and Jeff Sachs kindly gave us that, and Jeff, thanks to you, I was able to cut back on some other slides because ours overlapped again. But we have, in the main points here, we know that the SDG number 4 includes expanded access, reduction of exclusion and marginalization, gender equity, and focus on quality of education, which from almost everybody's perspective includes learning and literacy. But there's a paradox here that does not appear in the SDGs, and I've added as point number 5. And I'd like to draw your attention to this. This is, in many ways, the main point of my presentation, and that is because of the good side of the United Nations SDGs, all countries, or nearly all countries, have decided to be part of these goals. The downside is that the governments are held responsible, and they go by national and international norms. And those norms typically mean that the poor and the marginalized get the least resources, are the least understood, and get the least focus of attention. We can discuss that later on, but I'm going to give you some examples. My first example is the target that is supposed to be of the SDGs and previously the MDGs, and that would be, let's say, a girl like Aminata who lives in northern Senegal, or might live anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa or in parts of, poor parts of India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, who is sitting in her classroom, bright-eyed, ready to learn, but is not learning, or is not learning sufficiently for reasons that I'll get to in just a moment. So, and Jeff had said accurately that income inequality from a national perspective, international perspective, has gone down. That is, there has been economic growth, a good side of the story. But anybody who's gone anywhere in rural parts of Africa or South Asia and parts of highland South America will know that there's what some people call the bottom of the pyramid. These are people whose lives have not changed materially over many hundreds of years, and even if they might have a mobile phone, the rest of their lives are impacted greatly by poor schools, by lack of textbooks, by poorly trained teachers, illiterate parents, issues around language, they may not speak the official language, and few direct prospects of work. This is the reality in spite of the other graph that we saw earlier. So where is this in the world? Well, this is sort of a heat map, if you will, but it just gives you a sense. I haven't said anything that contradicts this, and you can debate whether your country is in yellow or orange or wherever, but you get the point. You were talking about a large part of the world, and that is, in fact, where the encyclical is focused. These are the stressed parts of the world. So what's happening in these countries? So as I don't know that it's been said, another good thing that, that has happened in the last 15 years under the MDGs is educational access has gone up. But what has happened in the poorest locations is the quality of education has gone down. And if you don't know that, you need to start looking at the data, such as the data I'm presenting here today, which shows that in any number of countries, Mali is at the top with the dotted lines around it, that less than 10% of the kids can read a single word at the end of second grade. Less than 10%, in fact, less than 3% in some languages. Now, if you look at that, there's another interesting data point that's hidden in that graph, and that is the issue of which language should be taught to kids. Now, I don't have much time. I'll touch on this point a little later on, and maybe we'll come back to it in the discussion. But if you look at this, whether you're speaking whether you're being taught in either of the two African languages, Malian languages, indigenous languages, or in French, you're still not reading at the end of grade 2. This is fairly damning for those who say, oh, we'll just teach in local language, that'll make all the difference. Now, there are reasons why that's true, and we could talk about that later. But this is not unique to Mali by any means. I'm going to switch gears to technology. I've heard various ideas on the table, and I know there are more technology talks coming up in the next couple of days. I've written a fairly long paper on this topic that's referenced in the paper that is on the table, that is on mobile solutions. And I'm going to go into a particular example in a moment, but I wanted to share with you a perspective on this. And that is, it's not enough to distribute tablets. It's not enough to have technical know-how or to make sure the machines don't die. It's not enough to decide who your end users are. It's not enough to have lived in a particular context. You need to put all those pieces together. You need to know what your purpose is. Now, I don't say this lightly. This is actually a huge challenge. Anybody here who's trying to put together a technology solution needs to know that there are all these different pieces to the puzzle. And having done a review, my group was funded to do a major review, and that's online, of the current technology projects that focus on learning. And there are almost none of them that put all these four pieces together. And I'm going to show you an example that we think does do this and has had pretty good success. And it's a project that started in India. I was talking with Dr. Prima earlier about this, that worked in 5 different languages in Andhra Pradesh. That project is now finished, but we ran out of money. I could go into detail about that, but that project has been resuscitated in South Africa, in the poorest province of South Africa. Some of you will know it, Limpopo province, which is in the far north of the country. And we developed a quadrilingual platform, not on the internet, not requiring online access, in the poorest schools of Limpopo. And it had a very simple purpose. The purpose was to reach children in a language they can understand, and that they had a choice of which language that was. And why did we do that? We did that because it turns out that kids who go to those schools often have teachers who don't speak their language. They may speak English, but most of the kids in rural Limpopo don't speak any English. So the question is, well, it took us about 5 years to develop the software. This was not an easy thing to do, and I don't have time to show you a video of it, but if you're interested over a coffee break, I could share it with you. So the results were actually dramatic, and they are as yet unpublished because the only results, we got them in the last month. But when you give kids a choice, the impact by 3rd grade is about 2 years in advance over the literacy, which is largely 0. It isn't hard to get 2 years advance, I have to say that. Going above baseline of poor kids learning is not that difficult. But these kids, by the end of the 3rd grade, were caught up to kids in Gauteng province, which is where Pretoria and Johannesburg are located, in terms of basic reading. It is very impressive, and all I can say is it just follows that model. And all I'm suggesting here is that if you're thinking of doing technology work, think in terms of not the devices that you're going to distribute, not even the languages you're going to distribute, but think of the purpose by which you're trying to initiate and address yourself to, let's say, the quality of learning goal of the SDGs. So this is a slide that will please, of course, the learning and literacy people. But I think that it's true, and I think it tracks also Jeff's earlier point, and that is that you can't do any of these SDGs if you are unable to have the basic skills. And I don't mean that learning is only about literacy. I do think that learning and literacy are overlapping, but unless you focus on the learning and literacy dimensions of children, youth, and adults, you will not be able to address any of these SDGs in an adequate way. So I put that at the center. I do think one could debate some of those points, but I'll leave that to discussion if we get there. So I want to come back to Aminata. So why would we care about Aminata? I mean, she's nice, she's the focus of the SDGs. Why would literacy be important if we don't even know if she's going to get into the workforce? Couldn't we just invest in somebody else who's going to go to Oxford or Harvard University later? The point we're trying to say here, and point number one, other people have said it, is literacy is we have lots of evidence that literacy is an enabler for poverty reduction, improved health, farming, and so on, across multiple sectors. Point number 2 is that something we have not talked about today, but several people have come close to talking about, is the notion that thinking in a sustainability fashion is something that we actually don't know a lot about. We know, I think we know, that learning and literacy are important. But the idea that you can think in a multifactorial way, that this is not just multisectoral for the United Nations Secretary General, this is multifactorial for every kid, every youth, every adult, and that thinking ahead, being able to sacrifice the present for a future that is more sustainable is something that many of us have a great deal of trouble accepting. How do we teach this? There are some interesting programs out there that are called awareness, environmental awareness, but I'm not talking about melting icebergs or glaciers. I'm not talking about that the world, there's a lot of migration or that it's going globalization. I do think that we, those of us who are educators here, have a big challenge in front of us. And some of this is actually in the paper, which talks about how difficult it is to think in both, in fact, there was a philosopher who wrote a great paper called The Perfect Storm, why it's so difficult to think about environmental sustainability. I would recommend that to you. It's cited in the paper. And finally, for Aminata, if she has to migrate, if she's chased out of northern Senegal or wherever she's living, if she ends up in Europe, if she ends up unemployed and having to move to the city, what can she take with her? Well, obviously the thing that she can take with her is what she has learned. So that's a fairly obvious point, but it's a point that we need to remember, that if you don't have learning, you actually have nothing. And that's why it's at the center of the SDGs. So by way of conclusion, my claim is that we not only need to say that the kids and youth and adults at the bottom of the pyramid are important, we need to find a way to have a science that actually allows us to know something about that population more than simply, for example, we saw earlier some data from the PISA. Now there's a PISA for development, some of you may know, is coming out that will rank many more countries in terms of how they're doing relative to the Singapores, the Shanghais, and the Taiwans of the world. But we will not know, and we do not know, we do not have a science yet of learning at the bottom of the pyramid. We have examples, but we do not have that science yet, and I would say we need it. That's bullet number 1. Second, we need technologies that are adapted for inclusion and for learning. They need to play a key role, and we need to be tougher, I think, with those who, even with ourselves. What are we really achieving? For example, if we had an internet-based brilliant solution for teaching kids reading, and kids don't have access to the internet, how effective is that? Similarly, even for teachers. Now, teachers often will have more access, but most teachers in the world are taught in the cosmopolitan international languages. When they get into these classrooms and have to teach Sepedi or Chavenda, they're at a loss, because they were taught how to teach English reading, not Chavenda and Sepedi. There is a lot of work to be done. And finally, my point is that sustainability solutions will need to have learning and literacy at the center, but also this notion that it isn't just teaching kids how to decode a word. It isn't just teaching kids how to do sums in mathematics. This is going to be more complicated for us. We often talk about critical thinking as something that you need to have as a secondary student in order to get into a good university. But we're talking about driving down this notion of critical thinking and sustainability thinking into much younger populations, not to the exclusion of the older people as well, because we know, and I can say, if you're familiar at all with the United States literature on the belief in climate change, you know that not everybody is on the same page on that issue. So my point, just to end here, is that poverty matters, being poor matters, and that being focused on the science of the educational dimensions of being poor is something we need to invest a lot of attention on. Thank you very much.